And we are back. This is lesson 2 of our Ecclesiastes Bible study. So you should have read through the whole book of Ecclesiastes at this point. If you haven't done that, just hit pause right now and go ahead and read through the whole book of Ecclesiastes. It's only 12 chapters. It will not take you that long, I promise, but it will be important. And read it in a translation you understand. So for most of us, that's probably not going to be the King James Version. Unless you grew up with it, you know all your Bible verses by heart in it, you've studied it a lot, so you're still familiar with the older word meanings and all that good stuff. But for a lot of us, it's probably not going to be the KJV. Find a translation you understand. It doesn't make you more holy to read a translation of the Bible that you have no clue what it's talking about. So NIV is good, ESV, New Living, even you can go with like a New Century version or a Today's English version. There's a host of good English translations out there. So read it through. If you haven't done that, press pause. If you have, let's keep going. So I wanted you to read through the whole book. Before we talked about, okay, so what are some big picture meanings of Ecclesiastes? Because I think it's important to kind of have an idea before we start slogging through this book. Okay, like, what's the point? Because it would be possible to get a little bogged down and a little discouraged, maybe disillusioned when we're in here. So I am going to rely on the words of some legit Old Testament scholars. So Derek Kidner is one of them, and he specializes in Old Testament poetry. So he, on page 20 of his commentary, this is a good little commentary. It's the Bible in the Bible Speaks Today series. Anyway, this is what he says. Okay, this is the big picture meaning. Here's the point of Ecclesiastes. He says, we face the appalling inference that nothing has meaning, nothing matters under the sun. It is then that we hear as the good news, which it is, that everything matters, for God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. That's the last verse of the book. That is how the book will end. On this rock we can be destroyed, but it is a rock, not quicksand. There is the chance to build. So Kidner's looking at Ecclesiastes as a whole, and he says, okay, so we see something appalling in here, that nothing under the sun matters, that there's no substantial meaning or point to anything. But at the very end we see, but everything does matter for God, which is new, a new thought from under the sun. So under the sun excludes God. Now all of a sudden we've included God, and we see that everything matters. It is through faith in him that we see more clearly. And Kidner points out that we can either be undone by a book like Ecclesiastes, or through the tearing down to our foundation through all of these philosophical arguments and quandaries and broodings and observances or observations, we can then be built up on the firm foundation of God. So that's Derek Kidner. All right. I'll put that out of the way. Now, Michael Eaton, this is from the Tyndale Old Testament Commentary series, he offers us a slightly different take on Ecclesiastes. So he says, what then is the purpose of Ecclesiastes? It is an essay in apologetics. It defends the life of faith in a generous God by pointing to the grimness of the alternative. So if we keep going to 55, he completes this thought a little more here. He says, he sets a limit not only to wisdom, but to all human resources. This is Koheleth. He is the frontier guard against any form of self-reliance. The fear of God, which he recommends, is not only the beginning of wisdom, It is also the beginning of joy, of contentment, of an energetic and purposeful life. The preacher wishes to deliver us from a rosy-colored, self-confident, godless life with its inevitable cynicism and bitterness, and from trusting in wisdom, pleasure, wealth, and human justice or integrity. He wishes to drive us to see that God is there, that he is good and generous, and that only such an outlook makes life coherent and fulfilling. So he and Kidner are really boiled down saying the same thing, but Eaton gives us this word apologetic. So he is making a case for, he's defending a life of faith in a generous God by pointing to the grimness of the alternative. And here in the middle section of Ecclesiastes, so we're talking about really chapter 1, verse 12, all the way to chapter 12, verse 7, it gets pretty grim in there. But Eaton is saying that the preacher, or Koheleth, is intentionally dragging us down to the depths so that we can better see, through contrast, the goodness of living a life through our faith in God. Now, Longman, and this is the New International Commentary, which is a bit more technical than the previous two that I've read. In his commentary, he gives us a little bit of a different view here. Not super different, but he comes at it from a different angle. He says, thus, if Koheleth's lengthy speech is pessimistic and out of sorts with the rest of the Old Testament, why is it included in the canon? Koheleth's speech is a foil, a teaching device used by the second wise man in order to instruct his son concerning the dangers of speculative, doubting wisdom in Israel. Just as in the book of Job, most of the book of Ecclesiastes is composed of the non-orthodox speeches of the human participants of the book, speeches that are torn down and demolished in the end. And if you've ever read Job, you know that his friends' speeches, God's like, y'all don't know what you're talking about there at the end of the book. So if anyone ever quotes Job, anything from Job, and says, see, you want to make sure you go in and see who's speaking, where in the book is this, because you got to be careful there. Longman goes on to say, in brief compass, the second wise man, who is the implied author of the book, summarizes the message of the Old Testament. First, he directs his son to fear God. This phrase calls him to a right relationship with God, a relationship that understands his dependence and subordinate status with God. Second, he moves to the nature of his son's continuing relationship with God. He urges him to keep God's commandments. If the phrase fear God reminds the reader of the beginning of Proverbs in the wisdom tradition, so the second imperative brings to mind the law. Finally, the frame narrator reminds his son that God will bring every deed into judgment. He invites his son to live in the present in light of the future. So, Longman looks at Ecclesiastes and he says, hey, Koheleth was an individual, teacher of wisdom, really smart guy, like a professor or something like that. And this other author found his speeches, or writings, his collected works, and framed them in the introduction and then the conclusion, and is using them, it says, as a foil in order to instruct his son, hey, this is how you want to live. Not like this. Again, he's teaching through contrast. Much as what Eaton was saying, just from the perspective that Ecclesiastes actually has two authors. There's one author who is Koheleth, and then the second author who's come in and taken Koheleth's work and framed it with his introduction, which are the third person parts. His introduction, verses 1 through 11, written in third person, and then the end, chapter 12, verses 8 through 14. That is a second author. Now, there's nothing like heretical about that, so be like, Don't be like, oh my gosh, what are you saying? There's no heresy inherent in there. It's okay. It is definitely okay for that to be true of Ecclesiastes. And we do see there's a voice change. Now, I am not going to be dogmatic on is that the case or not. I will say that at times that's a helpful way to view it. There's definitely a case to be made, but there's also a case to be made in the other direction for the unity, for the Koheleth. The preacher is the author of the whole text. But this is the view that Longman gives, that he is taking the unknown author is taking Koheleth, and he's taking his non-orthodox speech, right? And he is holding it out and saying, look, you don't want to be like this. And then at the end, he's saying, you want to be like this. So that is another perspective we can look at. But honestly, he's in agreement with Kidner and Eaton that we don't want to just view life as under the sun, that we want to bring God into the picture. And then Ian Provan is the last one that I'll read, and he helps us with kind of giving us a modern kind of takeaway here. And this is in the new NIV application commentary, and so one really helpful thing about this commentary series is that there's always a section whenever they're going through the text of modern meaning. The authors go out of their way to relate the scripture to us present day. And in a book like Ecclesiastes, that can be very helpful. So here's what he says. He says, it is first of all a message for those who cling still to the world of illusion, which is daily and powerfully presented to us as substantial reality by our various media. Kohelet dispels our illusions. The universe is not comprehensible and malleable. We cannot make any lasting mark on it. We cannot, by pursuing wisdom or wealth, find fulfillment and joy. Death, in particular, mocks all attempts at elevation to divinity and the refusal to be mortal and human. So that is one very good modern takeaway that we can still take. 2, it is also a message for those who understand all this and are looking for a different way of thinking and living, who are seeking to replace illusion with truth. Kohelet says to such people, understand that God exists. The universe we inhabit comes from his hand and comes to us as a gift. Our lives are a gift, offered for a short period and then taken back once again. Embrace life for what it is rather than what you would like it to be. Live it out before God, reverencing and obeying him. This is the pathway on which joy lies, even though puzzlement and pain will also be found there, and there are never guarantees about how things will turn out. So Provan boils it down for us and says that one of the big clear messages that is still relevant for us today is that, hey, we are not the masters of our universe. Much of our world is still mysterious to us, and we need to rid ourselves of the illusion that we can achieve lasting satisfaction, that we can achieve everything that we want, and then we can remake the universe however we see fit and live forever. We need to get rid of that illusion and embrace the fact that we're mortal and our lives are brief. And he says, and you want to add to that God exists, and that it is best to understand, hey, my life is brief, my life is short, but it's a gift from God, and if I live it out before God in reverence of him, obeying him, seeking his will and his ways, that is where I'm going to find joy. That is where I'm going to find satisfaction, and things aren't just going to be futile. So Longman offers us that more specific message to us that I think is very helpful. Now that we have talked about this, we're going to dive into the text. We're just going to go through this introduction section of Ecclesiastes. So we're going to look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. So if you have got your Bible, I hope that you will be reading along with me. I hope you've got things to take notes on. I'm going to drink some water now. Take notes on as we go through this. So I'm going to read the text first, and then we will dive in. So, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, I'm reading out of the ESV. It says this: "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The winds blow to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. There is a thing of which it is said, 'See, this is new.' It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after." I hope you're encouraged. Let's end. I'm just playing. So, reading this introduction, get a real sense of, okay, this is going to be an interesting ride here. So in the first verse, we get the introduction of the author or the speaker, or we're introduced to who is going to be like our main character here in this story. But it's not a story. I don't know why I said story. In this book, there's not really a narrative structure to this at all. This would be more like philosophy. But we are introduced to the preacher. And that is the English translation for Koheleth that the ESV uses. New American Standard uses that one also, but there are other English translations as well. But we see the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, I've already said that traditionally Solomon is attributed the authorship of Ecclesiastes, but most scholars believe that Solomon is not the true author. Some of that is because the language looks like it's from a later period of history. Another part of that is that in the text, Koheleth talks about all the kings that have come before him. There was only one king in Jerusalem that came before Solomon, David. So it seems kind of odd to use that phrase, but what's probably happening is we're supposed to think Solomon. We're supposed to be like Solomon. So it could be that this preacher, this Koheleth, is taking on the persona of Solomon, or we're supposed to think of this as if Solomon was writing, knowing that it's not really Solomon, or we're supposed to think, okay, this is a person like Solomon. So someone who's kind of like embodies the life of Solomon, this long pursuit of wisdom over the years, and this is the kind of person that is writing this. And that's probably closer to the truth. This could be a later king. I know some scholars throw out other kings' names like a Hezekiah. There's not really any evidence for that. And honestly, we don't need to know, was this Solomon or not. It is interesting that Solomon's name is not mentioned, but it's kind of like they're going out of the way to be like, think about Solomon. But we're supposed to be thinking of someone who is this great pursuer of wisdom, this great teacher. So that is the introduction that we get here in verse 1. Now, the translation of the preacher. And I'll switch between calling Koheleth, which is the Hebrew word that is there, or the preacher. But this word can be translated convener, collector, teacher, preacher, professor, speaker, president, spokesman, philosopher, like assembler, meaning like of sayings. So there are a lot of different ways that we could translate this into English, and that's why a lot of scholars will just use koheleth as a Hebrew loanword. They'll just bring the Hebrew word straight into English and not attempt a translation because it doesn't really capture this here. Because when we say preacher, we'll think like a church. We'll think that he's having a church service, and that is not what is going on. It is definitely religious in nature at times, but at other times it's not. So that's why koheleth is probably just as safer just to use the Hebrew word. So that is in verse 1. And I'll refer to the various scholars who give us some various insights and sometimes in conflict with one another. But Eaton looks at this and he's like, okay, so what the preacher is doing is presenting facts here. He is saying, okay, let me tell you about life. Here's some facts about life. And he's doing it as like a write-up of Solomon's story. He's using like the persona of Solomon, or maybe like a historical fiction might be a good way to look at it. But he's maybe like a class project, do a write-up of Solomon's story, and he's saying, okay, I'm gonna lay out some facts about life for you. And Eaton says that he is presenting the truth, but not the whole truth. He's keeping some back intentionally. It would be, think about politicians. So we got an election coming up. This was several years ago, but the fair tax became pretty popular. If you're not, you don't know what the fair tax is, it's this tax reform scheme that would remove all federal taxes, get rid of all federal taxes, income tax, all of it. It's all gone. All the federal taxes are gone, and it would replace them with a 23% national sales tax. So there are no longer any federal taxes whatsoever except a 23% national sales tax. Now, when the fair tax, and this was when the Tea Party was kind of popular, and a lot of those people were fair tax people. So when the fair tax was popular and other politicians were running against those individuals, they would say things like, that person wants to raise your taxes by 23%. That person wants to make you pay an extra 23% sales tax on everything you buy, which was true, but not the whole truth. They didn't then say, but they would get rid of all your other taxes, right? So it's saying the truth, but not presenting the whole truth. He is saying that's what the preacher, that's what koheleth is doing here. Now, as we move on from verse 1, we get into verse 2, which is if we don't know anything about Ecclesiastes, we probably know this verse. We've heard it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The ESV takes a very literal approach to this translation. So in Hebrew, the word translated as vanity is literally used in there 5 times. And so we get the same thing in English. And that is just this incredible emphasis on here. So Kidner is looking at this, and he sees verse 2 as like, this is the motto of the preacher. Koheleth, this is his motto, and he's letting us know. Vanity of vanities, everything's vanity. Now, the Hebrew word is habel, that's what's translated as vanity here in the ESV. New American Standard uses vanity. NIV uses meaningless. And we'll kind of get into how do we best understand this. Well, this Hebrew word, habel, literally means a puff of wind, a wisp of vapor, a mere breath. So like, that's habel. And it is talking about brevity, unsubstantiality, emptiness, unreliability, frailty, futility, something that has no effect. Providence looking at the meaning, and he says that ephemeral, that something that doesn't have any kind of lasting effect, fleeting, that is the meaning that the preacher is using in Ecclesiastes. He says that the NIV's translation of meaningless is a little bit misleading, that the preacher isn't saying that everything is meaningless, but that everything is fleeting. It has no lasting, substantial impact, or futile would be a good way to characterize it. That's how we should take vanity of vanities. Whereas Longman comes in and says, no, the meaning is meaningless. NIV has done a good job with their translation. And he points to areas where that can be true. I would say this, that the idea of like brevity and of futility probably captures the tone a little better and is more applicable in most of the settings and verses than meaningless. Meaningless can definitely apply in plenty of places in Ecclesiastes, but more of the scholars are going with the ephemeral, futile interpretation as opposed to the meaningless interpretation. So I would say that's probably what we need to have in our heads. Although I think meaningless, everything is meaningless, kind of captures the thought as well. Maybe just not as precisely. But we'll see in here, the preacher says vanity of vanities. So he's using a superlative. So he's saying utter futility, like as futile as you can get. Everything's untrustworthy, everything's unsubstantial, no endeavor will bring any kind of permanent satisfaction. That's verse 2 for you. Woohoo! Yeah, we're excited about that. And Kidner points out that the preacher Koheleth, he takes trains of thought further than most of us would care to take them. That he goes all the way to their end and looks at them as, in their deepest, darkest realities. And so that's kind of what he's doing throughout here. Now, and so Kidner makes verse 2 kind of stand out as, hey, this is the motto. Now, Eaton, when he's looking at this section, he's like, okay, verse 1 is our introduction, that's who's talking, but verse 2 through 11, this is like our first main section, and the preacher, Koheleth, is talking about the failure of secularism. Verses 2 through 11 belong together, we don't need to separate two out, and he is saying that Koheleth wants to undermine the secular worldview by pointing out some of its basic facts, by just making some factual observations. And he wants to undermine, okay, when I look at the world under the sun, I remove God from the equation, I set my parameters where I'm just looking at the physical world, the secular world, it's not good, right? So he wants to undermine that secular worldview. And so in verse 2, he would say this is the futility of life, right? In verse 3, he would say, and the consequences of the futility of life for people are that life pays no dividends. That's what does man gain by the toil at which he toils under the sun? Again, the ESV is taking a more literal translation, and so the Hebrew verb it's used again. So this is how the Hebrew listeners would have heard it, or readers would have read it, the toil at which he toils. That's a literal translation there. That's not just clunky English. That's giving us the thought and the mood as well. And so Eaton was like, it says, okay, so verse 3 is talking about, so these are the consequences for people, that life, it pays no dividends. There's no gain to be had from a secular worldview. And then verse 4, the impossibility, a generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The impossibility of getting rid of the problem. There's no conceivable end to earthly futility because the earth, it's just here. And then he looks at verses 5 through 7 saying, okay, it's the implication through man's view of nature, and through, in verses 8 through 11, man's view of history, that 5 through 7 are, this is toil without progress. You remove God from creation and all you get is weariness. That's what verse 8 is talking about. And then in verse 8 where it says, a man cannot utter it, that's literally words cannot describe the utter futility of life under the sun. And then in verses 9 through 10, again, we get this cyclical, this never-ending cycle of futility, which is a contrast through the Orthodox Hebrew thought of that history is traveling towards a goal, right? That Yahweh intervenes and does some new things in history. These verses 9 and 10 are a contrast to that. So Eaton pulls out, sees it structured in a different way. If we go back to Kidner, though, he has separated verse 2 and says, hey, this is kind of the motto. And then in verse 3 through 11, he's saying, this is like the treadmill. The treadmill, you spend all that effort, but you never go anywhere. I call it the dreadmill. A lot of runners call it the dreadmill because we're nerds. But he is like, this is life's treadmill. And verse 3 introduces that. What does a man gain by all the toil in which he toils under the sun? All this effort is put forth, but you never get anything. You never profit from it. There's no dividend that's paid to you. You're just toil. And then verses 4 through 11, you're expounding on what this theme that he introduces, Koheleth introduces in verse 3. And the mood here is that the weariness of doing much and getting absolutely nowhere. And that is that so many beginnings end where they begin. So you haven't gone anywhere. It's why I have trouble running around the track, because you're just going in a loop over and over again. I lose my mind. You never see anything new. It's boring. And so in verse 4, Kidner's saying, look, generations, they don't really change anything in the world. It's all the earth. It's the same. The sun, it just rises and sets, rises and sets, rises and sets, rises and sets. It never does anything new. The wind, it just blows and then blows again. It just kind of goes around in a circle. The waters, they all go to the sea, but it never gets filled up. And they just keep going around and going around and going around. Verse 8, we just experience the same things over and over and over again. And then verses 9 through 11, there's nothing new in the human realm. We do the same types of things. They just keep happening. And we see that under the sun is used in verse 3 and verse 9, setting our parameters. How are we looking at the world? What is our perspective? Well, we're looking at from a secular point of view. I think that is important. And so we can see here that while Eaton and Kidner are using different structures, they're really pointing to the same meanings here. We're just getting there in different ways. I tend to favor Kidner's characterization because I see that verse 2 kind of stands out and verse 3 kind of stands out. And so when I look at it, I say verses 1 through 11 serve as an introduction to the book. That verse 1, we are introduced to the preacher, Koheleth. Verse 2 and 3, we get the theme of the book. And verses 4 through 11 give us the mood of the book. This kind of like weariness and toil that never gets us anywhere. And the theme, verses 2 and 3. Futility, because we can toil and toil and toil and nothing substantial, nothing lasting. We don't get anything lasting out of that. And that sets the mood for life under the sun. Now, a good takeaway here is offered to us by Pravin. So he says, looking at verse 3, that's the key for him. And he says that, so if we look at verse 3, what does a man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? So looking at that under the sun. So we're having just a purely naturalistic, materialistic worldview. And he would say that we need to have a God-centered view of creation. That we need to be able to look at creation and see God in the very center of it, not just arguing evolution versus creationism. Some people get bogged down in that, but it's having a God-centered view of creation is more than that. It's more than just giving a nod to it. It's seeing God as the sustainer. It's seeing God as intimately equated with his creation. It's seeing God as more than just kind of distant, yeah, he created it, but he doesn't really have anything to do with it now. It's seeing him in more than that. And it's asking ourselves the question that Jesus asked. So Matthew 16:26, and this is in Mark and Luke as well. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? This is, Koleth is saying, hey, you could gain the whole world. It wouldn't matter. It'd be futile. It'd be vanity. It'd be just this puff of wind that gets blown away, this little wisp of a cloud that gets blown away. It'd be fleeting. It wouldn't make any kind of a lasting impact. So what good will it be if we gain the whole world, yet we forfeit our souls? So as we get into Ecclesiastes, we need to remember that a secular worldview, or viewing life just under the sun, should be vastly different than a Christian worldview, in which God is still at the center of creation itself, but also at the center of our lives. But also, I think a good takeaway is, so we're being real here. So the Koleth he's not giving us some kind of rose-colored glasses here, surface level. No, he digs deep, and it is good for us to dig deep. Sometimes the characterization of Christians that we kind of check our brains at the door and we're just like, tell me what to think and I will repeat it. Sometimes that's warranted. But true pursuit of God means that we're going to think deeply about things. I've never thought more deeply than I have when considering theology and considering Scripture and considering my relationship with the Lord, and making sense of life here under the sun. I've never had to think more deeply. And so may it never be said of us that we check our brains at the door. No, Christians should think deeply about all things, but do so with the understanding that there's more to the world than just what's under the sun. When we come back in Lesson 3, we will continue on with Chapter 1.